Welcome everyone to Play to Win, Seizing Opportunities in the FCC Citizens Broadband Radio Service Auction for Priority Access Licenses. I'm Angela Long and I'm helping to facilitate today's webinar. A couple of housekeeping points. We encourage questions. Please use the Q&A box that should be on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. We are recording today's webinar and will make it available to everyone. Womble Dickinson is thrilled to be bringing you this webinar today. We're a transatlantic law firm serving corporate, individual, and nonprofit clients in every sector. We bring an entrepreneurial approach to what we do in an increasingly connected world. Our speakers today include Bob Silverman, Senior Counsel at Womble Dickinson. Bob advises telecommunications carriers and technology companies seeking to navigate through complex regulatory, commercial, and compliance structures. Marjorie Spivak, partner, also at Womble Dickinson. Marjorie represents telecommunications and broadband carriers across the U.S., advising them on all aspects of regulatory compliance, particularly on tower and antenna site matters. We're thrilled to announce our special guest, Amit Patel, CTO and Sales Director for U.S. Major Accounts at NOKIA. Amit supports regional carriers, rural operators, and WISPs with LTE deployments, fixed wireless solutions, and private LTE applications. At this time, I'm going to hand you over to Bob Silverman, who will start the presentation.
Thank you, Angela. I appreciate everyone calling and joining us here today, particularly in the midst of these very, very unusual and challenging times. But it's actually because of these very challenging circumstances that we're facing, what with social distancing and quarantines and lockdowns, that we're realizing that access by all to reliable and robust high-speed broadband is more critical than it's ever been before. This upcoming CBRS auction, or Auction 105, is the first mid-band spectrum auction for broadband, 5G, and various other innovative uses that we'll address. And it's a major step toward fulfilling this critical need. But to ensure that people in all of our communities, particularly our rural communities, are reached, vigorous participation is needed. So thank you for doing your part and getting more information on looking to participate. As you can see here, our aim with this webinar is to provide key and practical information about the CBRS and these priority access licenses, or PALs, from a regulatory point of view, from a use case and equipment point of view, which Amit at NOKIA will address, and we'll also walk you through the steps needed to get your foot in the door by way of the short form application. So we're going to touch briefly on the auction and bidding procedures. We're really going to save the deep dive on those for further down the road in offline discussions and possibly even another webinar. But to get us started, I'm going to hand this over to Marjorie Spivak, and she's going to go over the key CBRS and PAL basics and details. Marjorie?
Thank you, Bob. The first thing I'm going to do is go through some of the CBRS basics. Obviously, this is a unique license framework with 3 tiers and priorities. The highest priority is for the incumbent access, and that includes federal radio location users, such as military radar systems, also satellite ground stations, and the grandfathered Part 90 3.65 gigahertz. And I just might point out now that breaking today, the FCC released an order extending the transition for both grandfathered and non-grandfathered incumbents in 3.65 and extending that transition deadline until October 17th, 2020. This was released today by the FCC's order. Basically, in light of the fact that many essential services are being provided, the FCC is concerned that everybody have access to wireless services, and due to the pandemic. But both grandfathered or not grandfathered, you operate consistent with your status. So that's the breaking news of the day. And the third level is the general authorized access, which may use any portion of the band not assigned to one of the higher tiers. And it's basically free. So the incumbent users have the highest priority. They receive protection from priority access licensees or PALs and the general authorized access users. And then priority access licensees have the second highest priority. They receive protection from GAA users. So the CBRS auction, what's available? The PALs are exclusive protected county-based license areas. They are licensed in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band. There are no PAL channels in the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band. That's for the general authorized access users only. Each county license area will have 7 10 megahertz licenses available. So there are 3,233 license areas for a total of 22,631 PALs available nationwide. There is a spectrum aggregation limit. There is a band-specific limit on PALs, and that applies to both licensees and to lessees, which we'll get into more later. So a PAL licensee can own up to 4 channels in a county, which amounts to 40 megahertz max per licensee. The FCC adopted this limit because it believes it will promote competition, innovation, and efficient use. And the FCC also wants diversity and would like to see at least 2 users in a county. The FCC did decline to include PALs in the spectrum screen. So it's not considered part of an attribution for spectrum such as cellular carriers may have. So it's really just a band-specific limit, and it does apply to both licensees and lessees. Okay, so the key element of the CBRS spectrum is sharing, and it's the architecture and dynamic coordination that is done through the Spectrum Access System administrators. They maintain a cloud-based database and listing, basically containing all of the CBRS base stations or CBRS devices. They have the geographic location and the tiers, and they can coordinate and facilitate sharing among the 3 tiers. In other words, they're managing interference from CBRS devices and among CBRS devices. In addition, to coordinate the federal incumbent military radar systems, there are environmental sensing capabilities that are deployed in strategic locations, often near naval bases and along the coastal regions. When an ESC basically alerts the SAS administrator that there's a radar present, the SAS might move the CBRS devices to other channels. A couple of other points. Any frequencies not in use by the PAL licensee may be used by the GAA users. In addition, the specific PAL frequencies are assigned by the SAS administrator. While you can request specific frequencies, there are no guarantees. Also, PAL licensees must register CBRS devices before operating them. No CBRS device may transmit without prior authorization from the SAS. The registering of the CBRS devices basically creates the PAL protection area, which is important in terms of leasing, which we'll discuss later on as well. Currently, there's 4 SAS administrators that are certified, and that's CommScope, Federal Wireless, Google, and Sony. Amdocs should be certified shortly, and PAL licensees can choose their SAS provider, and we will discuss that more also with regards to next action. Next, I'd like to talk about the regulatory requirements that are applicable to CBRS PALs. First, there is regular flexibility. Licensees are permitted to provide service on a common carrier or a non-common carrier basis. The license term is 10 years with an expectation of renewal. The PALs are also subject to an end-of-term performance requirement and must operate their CBRS devices in compliance with technical rules and certified professional installation requirements, which adds a new level of compliance to the spectrum. As to the CBRS devices, there are two defined classes of base stations. There's Category A and Category B. The Category A can be used indoor-outdoor. They're basically small cell or enterprise cells. Examples include low-power outdoor fixed devices or local indoor LTE mobile access. The Category B are meant for outdoor only, and they can be used for fixed wireless purposes. Some Category A devices, have the CPI requirement, and Category B, the CPI requirement is there always. It has to be installed by a certified professional installer. So the end-of-term performance requirement. In short, PALs have to provide a bona fide communication service that meets a substantial service standard of performance. Substantial service is defined as a service which is sound, favorable, and substantially above the level of mediocre service, which might minimally warrant renewal. It's the same definition that was used recently in the 700 megahertz or LMDS services. Licensees can demonstrate compliance by meeting one of two safe harbors that the FCC adopted, one for mobile service or point-to-multipoint service. And to meet that safe harbor, the licensee must demonstrate substantial service by showing it provides reliable signal coverage and offers service over at least 50% of the population in the license area. So it's a 50% population coverage requirement. For point-to-point service, you can demonstrate substantial service by showing that you've constructed and operate using Category B CBRS devices for populations of 134,000 or fewer. You must construct 4 links in the license area. Where population is greater than 134,000, the licensee has to construct 1 link per 33,500 people, and that has to be rounded up to the nearest link whole number. So in short, the population of the license area should be divided by 33,500 and rounded up to the nearest whole number. So if it comes out to be 5.7 links, you need to build 6 links. Now, if you don't meet one of the safe harbors for either mobile service point-to-multipoint or point-to-point, you can do an individualized showing of substantial service. The licensee must demonstrate that they provide a bona fide communication service either for unaffiliated customers or for their own private internal use that meets the standard of substantial service. Where a licensee provides a mix of services that may be covered by one of the safe harbors, they can demonstrate compliance with one of those safe harbors, or you can make an individualized showing that the services in combination meet the standard of substantial service. These are all done on a case-by-case basis, and you really have to show that you're either serving a niche market or that you are providing great enough mix of service that it is considered substantial. Importantly, the FCC did not adopt interim performance requirements. They reasoned that the end-of-term requirement would limit the potential for spectrum aggregators to acquire spectrum without any plans to actually deploy the services. And to demonstrate substantial service for the end of term requirement, the verification is similar to the 700 megahertz or LMDS requirements. Licensees have to file a construction notification on FCC Form 601. They must submit and certify to a description of the service with documentation of the extent of service, including electronic coverage maps. And to demonstrate coverage, the PALs can only rely on the PAL protected areas of the relevant CBRS devices that they use to provide the service. So licensees have to specify the CBRS devices and certify that they're actually being used to provide the service, either to customers or for internal use. Licensees may not claim coverage outside of the PAL protection areas or deployments that are not reflected in the SAS records. So all CBRS devices have to be registered in order to show compliance with the substantial service requirement. And finally, the failure to meet the end of term performance requirement results in automatic termination of the authorization. There is no use or lose regime for PALs. There is a renewal expectancy, and that's under the Part 1 rules 1.949, and under that section, a PAL licensee has to qualify for renewal must demonstrate that over the course of its license term, they either provided and continue to provide service to the public or operated and continue to operate the license to meet the internal private needs of the communications provider. Also, as to discontinuance of service, PAL licenses are subject to the wireless radio service permanent discontinuance rule, and that's contained in 1.953. So with regard to secondary markings and leasing opportunities, licensees can partition and disaggregate their license. That's in accordance with 1.950. However, they have to mandate a construction and operation requirement for each license. And there's two options to satisfy that requirement. Under the first, each party may certify that they'll individually satisfy the service-specific requirement, and if they fail to do so, they individually face any performance penalties. Under the second option, both parties can agree to share responsibility to meet the performance requirement, but if they fail to do so, they're both subject to the penalties, which is automatic termination of license. Licensees can also partially assign or transfer their licenses and may enter into de facto transfer leasing agreements for a portion of their licensed spectrum under existing rules now. For spectrum manager leases, the FCC has a new light touch leasing policy. It's really for immediate processing. It streamlines the notification process, and it involves the SAS administrator. Basically, the process is that lessees who are going to want to engage in light touch leasing, they have to pre-certify with the FCC or with the SAS that they meet the non-lease specific eligibility and qualification criteria. And these include basic qualifications such as compliance with the foreign ownership eligibility criteria, character and other qualification requirements, that they're eligible under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988. And any lessee who already holds a PAL license is automatically qualified. Next, the actual PAL licensee can notify the SAS administrator of a leasing arrangement, and at that time, the SAS administrator will confirm that the lessee has met the pre-certification requirements and that the parties together meet the lease-specific eligibility rules. And those include that the lease must not trigger a violation of the 40 megahertz PAL spectrum aggregation limit for any geographic area. And the leased area must fall within the lessor's service area, but outside of its PAL protection area, which is defined by the CBRS devices. Once the SAS coordinator confirms this, the lessee can immediately begin using the leased spectrum. And on a daily basis, the SAS coordinator provides this information to the FCC in an electronic report. So they make the FCC aware of any leasing notifications. So this new light touch advanced notification scheme, it basically substitutes the existing rules for immediate processing under 1.920E2. But if licensees are not concerned about immediate leasing, then they can also enter into Spectrum Manager leases using the general 21-day notification procedures. It's really an option for streamlining the process. So I am now going to turn it over to Amit Patel, who is with NOKIA, and he's going to discuss the CBRS equipment and uses. Amit?
All right. Thank you, Marjorie. I think after all that detail, I'm going to try to maybe kind of hopefully talk about why it's worth going through all that detail. Turns out CBRS was originally defined by the FCC and called the innovation band. And it was called that because there were so many different people that were interested in leveraging a spectrum that, that had a wide variety of uses. What we're trying to depict on this slide is some of those uses that exist. In particular, as you can imagine, if we start in the upper left, right, wireless users, including the large operators, they have a great interest in the spectrum because they see it as a way to get, whether it's PAL or GAA, a way to get extra spectrum to provide increased broadband connectivity. So that is a key use case that NOKIA is pursuing. This primarily is focused on dense areas where, because the CBRS power rules don't allow for great propagation, at least to mobile devices, we typically focus on some of our solutions for dense urban areas. Building on the kind of this mobile broadband scenario, there's also a great interest in what we refer to as neutral host roaming scenarios. The idea that there's a lot of places where there isn't good coverage today from a mobile operator, and whether it's in building or some remote areas, if you could build out CBRS and the mobile operators are willing to roam on your network, then automatically there's a way to provide great connectivity in more areas, as well as provide maybe a business opportunity for those entities that want to build a roaming network. I list this one as future, primarily because we haven't yet seen the large operators or even the medium and small operators build roaming relationships around CBRS, but there is constantly discussion around that and activity, so we all believe that it will come in the near future. If I go to the upper right, fixed wireless. This is probably the area where there is the most activity right now amongst operators. We see fixed wireless activity across not only wireless operators, we see it across wireline operators, both medium and small, medium, and large. We see it across cable operators, and of course we see it across the wireless ISP segment. So fixed wireless, primarily, I think it's really booming this segment because of some of the recent innovations that have happened in wireless overall. Things like better modulation with 256 QAM, multi-MIMO, whether it's just 4x4 or even all the way up to 64x64. And just even the reduced cost of chipsets, making the radios and the devices more affordable. And then, of course, most important is many people expect that they will be able to get GAA spectrum for free, and where necessary in the rural area, they can go after PAL licenses at what they hope to be relatively low prices in rural areas where the demand will be lower. So fixed wireless access is low-hanging fruit for anybody who has interest in internet access, which, as we know, is basically everyone everywhere is interested in internet access. If I continue to the lower left, Private LTE is also another exploding area. Over the past few years, the manufacturing and utility segments have been very active in the 3GPP standards, where we define the use cases around LTE in particular. And they've been very active in CBRS Alliance. I'm going to come back to what the CBRS Alliance is on my next slide, but this is another body that's helping improve the deployment of CBRS-related solutions across the U.S. But because the manufacturing utility segments have been very active, their really desire for this was they were looking for reliable, high bandwidth, secure networking solutions that they could leverage not only maybe at a plant, across a farm, across a city, et cetera, right? So they've been looking for solutions that could meet this need. And leveraging spectrum that is, if it's a PAL license, it's licensed. If it's GAA, then that can augment what they have in other bands with unlicensed spectrum. And then finally on this slide, in-building is another area that's been growing more and more. For in-building, there are these specific verticals that I've listed here and others that have shown great interest in CBRS. Their drivers, just like manufacturing utility segment, are also wanting to have reliability, higher bandwidth, secure networking. Some of these things they do with Wi-Fi today, but as we all know, Wi-Fi can often get overloaded. And with Wi-Fi 6 coming, that will improve that. But we're finding that there are these set of verticals that have some critical needs, whether it's security or lower latency, or just have a separate secure network separate from Wi-Fi. There's a lot of interest in leveraging CBRS for an internal network inside of these different verticals. And then the last one that's in this blue box is big box stores. Interesting enough, there's a lot of interest in stores such as Walmart, Best Buy, Joann Fabrics, Walgreens, those types of stores that have a lot of traffic that come through where they want strong signal inside. But also the idea that with a CBRS network, you could actually enable kiosks and other things that can go inside these big box stores that improve the experience for customers like us when we enter those stores. If I go forward, in terms of NOKIA and the equipment that we have, we have a variety of equipment that we built for the CBRS band. It goes from indoor solutions, low and medium power outdoor solutions, and even an upcoming massive MIMO solution. From a NOKIA perspective, we started working on CBRS, 4 years ago in early 2016. Our first activity around this spectrum was actually done with Google to generate some fanfare and generate momentum. We're actually an original member of the CBRS Alliance. I mentioned that earlier. The CBRS Alliance is an organization that consists of a large, today now, well over 100 different entities. It has operators, vendors that support RAN radio equipment, device equipment, SaaS vendors, chipset vendors, et cetera, right? It's a very broad-based organization that's focused on making sure that the CBRS ecosystem, all the way from devices to radios to core to application layer, all come together and more seamlessly interoperate. And in fact, they actually have created their own certification that's based on, if you meet certain requirements and go through their testing, you're essentially certified with this label called OnGo certification. In the case of NOKIA, all of our products are FCC certified as well as OnGo certified. And so given that, we've been involved in numerous activities over the past 4 years. Didn't mention it earlier, but it was really January where the FCC declared CBRS now open for commercial use. Prior to that, we were in this phase called the initial commercial deployment, ICD phase. And prior to that, we were really just in trial and demo phases over the past few years. Across these, last several years, we've done a few hundred engagements with different customers across all the different scenarios that I mentioned on the previous slide, right? Leveraging indoor and outdoor scenarios, fixed wireless, private LTE, you know, even some neutral host scenarios that we've played with. Oops, sorry. So what I want to end with for my segment here is really maybe coming back to two of the use cases that I mentioned are really just booming. Fixed wireless access is a segment that, as I mentioned, there's an interest in across all different types of operators. And in particular, you know, because of the technological improvements, you know, I list here some of the theoretical speeds that we're capable of achieving now. You could see that with one of our radios, you know, our MBO, which is an all-in-one unit. That's the second one from the top. That unit, all you need is an Ethernet connection to it to get to a centralized core. And so it's a very easy deployment. You know, that one box can generate very quickly, you know, well over 300 megabits per second going out to a sector. And we have customers using this product directly to LTE devices, but in many cases we have customers connecting these to MiFi devices and then broadcasting Wi-Fi from there to users, right? So there's interesting use cases there, as well as the traditional fixed wireless, right, where you put this up on a pole or a tower and you connect to a radio on the side of somebody's home. And then if we go to the product that's right below that, the micro radio head, that is actually even more powerful. It can support just under a gigabit of speed, again, theoretical. I mentioned theoretical because in real world, you know, speeds will often obviously vary depending on interference that exists in the area, morphology, the amount of spectrum you might have available to you from the SAS, you know, distance from the radio, et cetera, right? So, but these are the theoretical speeds that the CBRS products that we have can achieve. One final point on fixed wireless. You know, there's so many programs right now at the federal level, right? We have the CAF program, CAF2, upcoming is the RDOF program, all focused around deploying broadband to more and more areas of the U.S. In addition, there are multiple state-led programs that provide funding. And then there's operators that just have organic build plans, right? Because, you know, internet access is still, you know, the primary thing that folks are looking for. Even today, as we all probably sit at home because of the pandemic, you know, we're all very focused on making sure our internet connectivity is sufficient. I'll end with private LTE. Private LTE is something that's also been booming. I mentioned that, you know, different vertical industries, different enterprise customers have been really active with the standards bodies and with vendors like us to really develop an end-to-end solution. From a private LTE perspective, we NOKIA actually today have over 120 deployments around the world. Many of those within the U.S., the majority of those in the U.S. are all based on CBRS because, again, it's a spectrum that has a very good performance, it has a good spectrum depth available, and for the most part, it's free so far, right? And then when necessary, these entities will consider even getting a PAL to make sure they're more guaranteed of having at least some spectrum, and then augment that with GAA spectrum in addition to PALs. One of the things we've done with private LTE is we've taken these radios, coupled it with a cloud-based core, cloud-based EPC, to really simplify the deployment. For those of you that are wireless operators, you know that traditional wireless can get complicated to deploy. But in the case of private LTE, we're more often than not working with an IT organization that's used to deploying Wi-Fi. So we've essentially streamlined our solution and the operations to make this solution very Wi-Fi-like in terms of deployment and management of it, with the focus being on IT organizations. So this is an area that's also booming for us. For those of you that might have more interest in private LTE scenarios from NOKIA, I've got a link here at the bottom of the slide that you can go to get a wealth of information. So with that, I will turn it over to Bob to continue.
Thank you, Amit. That was very, very useful. And hopefully by now, what you've heard so far from a regulatory point of view and an equipment and use case point of view is either eye-opening or consistent with what you've been hearing, and makes you want to move forward in the auction. And so in order to actually move forward in the auction, we need to recognize that this is the time to start preparing. The application window opens next week on March 26th at noon Eastern time, and will close later in April 9th, 2020, strictly at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Do not play with that deadline. It is definitely enforced strictly. So we really encourage getting an early start so that you're not even coming close to trying to worry about the 6 p.m. Clock on April 9th. One item we're going to cover here, but is triggered by the April 9th deadline, is the period of prohibited communications. We'll get into detail on that further down in the presentation, but just do realize that once that April 9th deadline elapses, you're in a very specific period of prohibited communications. It does affect your individual and business behaviors during the course of the auction. So just we'll put a pin in that. But one of the reasons we're having this webinar now and encouraging all kinds of discussion is because until that April 9th deadline, you are free to have all the discussions you want. And we absolutely encourage that, asking questions. And we'll get to the sort of next steps of discussions that you should be having. But do realize right now, until April 9th, all communications are fair game. Here right now are some key auction dates that you'll want to put on your calendar. The short form application, which is due April 9th, there is an FCC tutorial posted. It is online. It's a little bit more of a recitation of the requirements, but do feel free to take advantage of that as it's an available resource. We'll put a pin in this upfront payment deadline, May 21st, 2020, also 6 p.m. So do realize these are not midnight deadlines. And we'll discuss the importance of that, and note that it is separate from the April 9th application deadline. We're anticipating a bidding tutorial on June 11th or sooner, a mock auction on June 22nd. That one is conducted by the FCC. And then we're expecting bidding to commence on June 25th, 2020. One question I'll just go ahead and address now, as it was raised, will COVID-19 change the schedule? As of a very recent discussion I had with staff, there right now, unless something has happened during the course of this webinar, there are no changes to the schedule. However, the FCC is actively monitoring the situation and will adjust accordingly if there's a need. So I think, like the rest of us, we're all kind of taking everything sort of day by day and week by week. So do still try to keep these deadlines in mind in the event that nothing does change. So we just want to be ready for that. So the short form application I've mentioned is FCC Form 175. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but this is just an overview of all the high points that we're going to address here. Everything from basic qualifications, ownership disclosures, which we will get into in detail, as those are important. Your authorized bidders. Note that there you can have up to 3, and again, as COVID-19 sort of becomes a ongoing scenario that may be worsening, your choice and determination of who your authorized bidders are will become all the more important. Maybe have a deep bench. And we'll talk about how your choice of authorized bidders can also have an impact on prohibited communications. We'll talk about bidding credit eligibility. That breaks off into a couple of different variants. Also, your bidding arrangements, whether you're going to participate individually or in conjunction with other parties through a consortium or joint venture. One item to note that we won't get into here is just former defaulter eligibility. If you've had issues with defaulting on any FCC or other federal payments, just let us know offline. It doesn't preclude you from participating, but there are a couple of hoops to jump through. Very important is your PAL selection. We'll go over that. And also the possibility of changes made to your application. Note that if you're really diligent and get your application ready and submitted, say March 27th, but something changes or you realize there's a correction, you can change it as much as you want up until the April 9th deadline. So after that, it becomes more restrictive. It's really just a matter of essentially administrative changes. Next slide. So PAL selection and upfront payments. This is important because this will establish the framework of your bidding activity in Auction 105. First thing to do is we've included a link here to the adopted PAL list. This is potentially different from the list that was initially proposed back in the fall. So if that's what you were looking at when you thought maybe I'm going to definitely participate, do make sure you're looking at the most recent list that was actually adopted earlier this month, as there may have been changes made to any of the information provided. They include in that list POPs, minimum opening bid, the upfront payment amounts, I'll distinguish those in a bit, and whether or not that county is subject to the small market bidding cap, also something I'll address further down. Note that once you've made your selection of PALs and submitted it with your Form 175, that's it. There are no changes to be made after the deadline. So this is where you want to be very careful, double, triple check, make sure your universe of bidding is not going to be impacted by the fact that you accidentally left something out. And also keep in mind that what you're selecting is all county-based PALs that you might possibly bid on. So it's not necessarily, unless you want it to be, let's say one county or two counties, it could be other neighboring counties, maybe less populated, maybe ones that probably won't draw as much competition. So it might be useful in the course of the auction not to drive up the price of your own, perhaps more competitive county, and so that you might be able to go to a county that's seeing less activity until you want to jump back. That's a strategy we can discuss more individually, but just do realize that you have the flexibility now to choose whichever counties you determine are advantageous to you in the auction. Upfront payment deadline. Do note that it is separate and well out a month after April 9th. The upfront payments are an amount basically attached to each license. It was calculated off a 1 cent per megahertz pop valuation with a minimum of $500 per PAL. And this essentially is buying your eligibility to bid in the auction, or it's basically buying your bidding units. And so the idea here is that if you're maybe on the fence, this gives you the opportunity to go ahead and start preparing your Form 175, get it in on time. And if you still need to have discussions and you still want to make sure this is, a business decision that you're going to get behind and follow through on, and if for whatever reason you decide not to, the upfront payment is the follow through on that. If you're definitely going to do it, you got to make sure you've made your upfront payment deadline, made your upfront payment timely by May 21st. And if you've decided you're going to bow out, you don't have to make an upfront payment. Your application will be deemed to be not qualified and you won't be participating in the auction, but you've had the chance to at least get that figured out. So consortia and joint ventures. This slide is really for those who want or considering participating, not individually, but in conjunction with other bidders. Now, I notice it's already 2:45, so I'm not going to spend too much time here, but just be aware that there are ways that you can participate with other entities, but it has to be in the form of a single applicant. Whether it's a consortium or joint venture is a bit of a nuanced decision, and it really is based on whether or not you're pursuing bidding credits and other considerations, and we can address those more in individual discussions. But generally, for the most part, the FCC does not want to see joint bidding arrangements, particularly involving nationwide providers. But if you're a non-nationwide provider, you do have these options. Just note that when you decide to move forward this way, it comes with a host of obligations. First, if you do enter into a consortium or a joint venture, you have to enter into that agreement before the April 9th deadline. So that's why it's important, if this is the route you're going to take, that you need to make sure you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's and make sure that this agreement is finalized so that next thing, it can be disclosed to the FCC. Transparency here is the key. And they will want to know if you are, or if this applicant is entering with the express purpose of essentially distributing the licenses to various members of the consortium. They want to know who, and they want to know under what agreement. And just note that what you disclose now will lead to more details being provided on the flip side or on the other side of the auction on your long form application. Ownership disclosures. This gets to be a very complicated aspect of the form, particularly if you've not participated in the auction. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but do realize that methodically working through your ownership structure so that you're making accurate and detailed disclosures as is required is key, so that you're not creating more complications on the other side. So you can refer to this slide later on, but just do be aware this becomes a bit of a hiccup sometimes in preparing short form applications, particularly if you don't know what you're doing. There's a lot of nuanced rules here. We'll keep moving forward. Bidding credits. There are different variants of bidding credits. One is this small business bidding credit, which does in and of itself break down into two types. Your very small business, which is a 25% discount, and that's demonstrated through average annual gross revenues of $20 million or less for the preceding 3 years, so 2017 through 2019. Or the small business, which is a 15% discount, and that is for annual gross revenues between 20 and 55 million. Just note that, again, there are complications and nuances related to how your revenues are attributed to the applicant. It does bring in a host of other controlling interests, affiliates, and affiliates of controlling interests. So again, this is if you're going to pursue this bidding credit, just know what comes with it and that you've sort of done your homework to make sure that you're not doing anything to shoot yourself in the foot and lose that bidding credit, which can become significant in the end. And just also note there are various unjust enrichment requirements so that if you do want to transfer or assign these licenses later on, it really needs to be to someone who also qualifies for the same bidding credit. The other bidding credit that's significant, if you're not going to do small business, is rural service provider. Generally, that means in total, your company collectively serves 250,000 or fewer subscribers, and that's all aggregated subscribers, wireline, wireless, broadband, cable, and that the areas you serve are predominantly rural, which is generally defined as counties with a population density of 100 or fewer persons. And that is also a 15% bidding credit. I'm going to just keep jumping so that we can start answering questions. Just also note there is yet another bid credit that comes post-auction, and this is only for licenses that qualify for certain tribal land, certain eligible tribal lands. I'm just going to leave the content here on the slide to speak for itself, but it exists. It's just post-auction, and it's on top of and separate from the other two bidding credits. So you can still be a small business or rural service provider and still get a tribal land bidding credit after the fact. There are bidding credit caps to be aware of, 25 million for small business, 10 million for rural service provider. I suspect this is not going to be an issue unless you're a fairly sizable company seeking to serve multiple states and many, many counties. Also, certain markets are considered quote unquote small market, and that's in partial economic areas that have 500,000 or fewer. Prohibited communications. This is very important. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but just know that, again, starting on the April 9th deadline, any applicant or bidder, and by applicant, I mean even the ones who decided not to start bidding, so non-participating applicants, are prohibited basically from communicating at all about bids or bidding strategies. This covers public and private disclosures. This covers indirect and implicit communications. And it also counts to have third parties that are conduits for potential prohibited communications. So that's what I was referring to when I said be careful who your authorized bidders are. If you're choosing a third party and that third party is representing another applicant, they have the potential to be a conduit for prohibited communications. This period will last, again, starting April 9th and lasting until the long form application deadline. We don't know when that will be, but do plan on it being several weeks out, if not potentially a month to 2 months, depending on how long this auction goes. So it's usually not that short, but just be prepared. Note also that fact of being an auction 105 participant, that you've applied and are considered eligible or not eligible, that's not a prohibited communication. That'll be released in an FCC public notice. So if someone says, did you apply in the auction, you can say yes or no. Just don't say anything beyond that. Note that this is very strictly enforced. Usually you have to report it within 5 business days of the communication. So overall, we want you to be proactively defensive. So talk to your auction experts, your counsel, to figure out, well, this is what I'm doing. Here's who I'm talking to in general. I want to make sure I don't get myself in trouble. And you can come up with a plan to be proactively defensive against who knows what, who your bidders are, who can even speak to bidding strategy, and limit your exposure before it becomes a problem. I'm not going to go into the auctions, bidding auctions overview, because we're really at the point where we just want to get your foot in the door. And again, we can cover the bidding specifics further down the road. It is very detailed. It is very nuanced. But I'm just going to let this information speak for itself so that we can start addressing questions. Next step, reference due diligence. Review your PAL list. Consider this spectrum and also consider future spectrum holdings. There's a C-band auction scheduled for way down the road in December. Now, we don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know if litigation or other factors will interrupt it, but 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, these things are in the pipeline. So just consider how this will play with that. Do talk to SaaS administrators and vendors. SaaS administrators, you saw there were 5 of them. They're all, the 5 that were listed are considered first wave. They're the first ones to have commercial activity. And so, those are the ones who have the best knowledge right now of where things are. And do keep in mind, they're still adjusting to actions taken by the FCC, including what happened today with the 3.65 licensees getting an extension. So some questions that are pretty SaaS specific, I would just try to talk to them. They're still, they just had their initial commercial deployment. They just completed them not too long ago. So this is still very fresh. So it's worth having that discussion. And they're all competing right now. So this is, you're right to try to win their business. Also talk to possible partners. Again, that lease, the secondary markets that Marjorie was talking about, and some of this light touch leasing, this creates a lot of new opportunities. So this is the time to start figuring out, well, what can we do with this? I have a county, I have 2 counties, and this is a great time to start building the foundation for what would come after the auction. And then auction prep, know who your bidders are, plan for that upfront payment deadline on May 21st, in conjunction with the PALs you've selected with your short form, and make sure you are getting help with your Form 175 so you don't set up your bidding and long form application frameworks incorrectly. We do have a questionnaire available if you've never done an auction before, so we can help get that streamlined. Just contact us and we'll make it available online or send it to you directly. And if you have done auctions, you can start using your prior Form 175 as a starting point, but don't assume that it's going to be sufficient for this auction. Things have changed. So that's basically where we are in terms of how to get your foot in the door. I do want to take a look at some of these questions, unless someone else has anything they want to start addressing. Someone is asking how long the auction will last. Again, we don't know, but probably a matter of just several weeks. How much do SAS?
A question about, can I get a rural bidding credit and a small business credit? And no. You can claim either a small business or a rural service provider bidding credit, and there are certain caps as well.
Right, but the tribal one is the one that is the one you can get in combination with the other 2. What else? You get your upfront payment back if you decide not to participate. Yes, if you do decide to make the May 21st deadline and you put your money in, and then you either you lose all your bids or you don't, whatever happens in the auction, you don't end up with a license, you will get your upfront payment back. Otherwise, it will just be applied to your final payment. What else have we got here?
Bob, I see a question on the price for SaaS service.
Yeah.
And it does vary depending on the SaaS vendor. They kind of have different models and maybe some different engines that they each have to provide analytical info. So you really have to check with each SaaS vendor. I do believe one of them has published some standard pricing, but in general, it can vary quite a bit.
Right. Yeah, and the choice of SaaS really also depends on a number of factors. I mean, a lot of carriers might even have existing relationships with a SaaS, and again, they're trying to be competitive here, so it's worth, it's really worth exploring and let them work to win your business. What else? Someone is asking an ownership disclosure question. I think that one would be more of an offline question. It's a little detailed about a board position, but generally we do want to be careful about individuals who have the potential to be a controlling interest for more than one applicant. I don't want to give a blanket answer, but if you have a board member and you're an applicant and you are aware that that board member might have some controlling interest in a separate applicant, just call us. We can help figure out that scenario. It can work out a number of different ways, but generally the FCC does not want to see individuals with controlling interest over separate applicants. We've hit 3 o'clock. Angela or anyone else, I don't know if there's anything else to quickly wrap up on.
Bob, this is Angela. We do have a couple of questions that were asked a little while ago. If you have a quick response, when will the SASs be operational to mitigate spectrum issues?
Oh, yes, for mitigating spectrum issues. SASs are operational now. Again, you really should just talk to them. Everyone is is really in their own situation right now commercially. And again, do realize they did just come out of initial commercial deployments. So I don't know if everybody is in the exact same state of readiness, but they are available to address their own capabilities commercially. So that's really what you need to do there. And just also keep in mind, again, there will be other SASs down the road. There is a second wave. We don't know exactly when that will, when they will reach the same state of being commercial and certified. But the 5 that we've listed in our slides are the ones that are in the first wave and are really the first ones out of the gate.
And Bob, we had a question from Daniel Neal discussing how the SAS is or multiple SASs are selected by the licensee with FCC review approval.
Right. The SASs, I mentioned that first wave, they were all, they actually started this process a long, long time ago. And the FCC, in conjunction with NTIA and the Department of Defense, worked through all of the lab testing to make sure that these SAS or these systems are all meeting FCC rules and capable of doing exactly what the CBRS items set out to do. They did undergo lab testing. They have undergone real-world testing in these initial commercial deployments, and so the FCC is the one who who has oversight over them. So that's the answer to that. I think we're basically done. Please, let us know if you have any questions, and we will be as responsive as we can to you.